Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care so that you can have real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. This is another episode of Your Questions Answered, and in last week's episode I explained how many blood tests should my critically ill loved one have in intensive care per day. If you haven't read, watched or listened to it, you can check it out here if you click on the link below this video. In this week's episode of Your Questions Answered, I want to answer another very important and frequently asked question of our readers at IntensiveCareHotline.com. And the question that I want to answer this week is: what could be the cause if my critically ill loved one is removed from an induced coma but still hasn't woken up? Many critically ill patients in intensive care, mainly if they have been admitted to ICU after surgery, after accidents, and or if they require a breathing tube for mechanical ventilation for their critical illness, have been placed in an induced coma. The induced coma or artificial coma means that your critically ill loved one is getting intravenous drugs or sedatives such as propofol or midazolam and opiates such as morphine or fentanyl that keep your loved one in a deep sleep, so that most body functions are kept at a minimum to not stress the body and your loved one. Tolerate the breathing tube in your loved one's throat and the mechanical ventilation, as they couldn't tolerate the breathing tube without the induced coma and without the sedation. Your critically ill loved one's body has time to recover and heal from surgery, accidents, head injury, etc. while they are in the induced coma. In any case, if your critically ill loved one requires mechanical ventilation and a breathing tube, he or she will need to be induced in a coma temporarily. If, however, the time comes for your critically ill loved one to be removed or woken up from the induced coma, there could be a delayed process for your critically ill loved one to actually wake up and come out of the induced coma. If all the sedative drugs, such as propofol and midazolam, and opiate drugs, such as morphine and fentanyl, for the induced coma have either been completely switched off or have been significantly reduced, so that your critically ill loved one should wake up in order to be taken off the ventilator and breathe by themselves, and you find that there is a significant delay in your critically ill loved one waking up after your loved one has been taken off the sedative and opiate drugs, there is generally no reason to panic. Several other reasons and factors may delay for your loved one to wake up and come out of the induced coma. So let's look at those reasons that may delay for your loved one to wake up and come out of the induced coma. Number 1. Your critically ill loved one has too many sedative and opiate drugs in their body system, and therefore those drugs have accumulated and delay for your loved one to wake up. Once the body has gotten rid of those excess sedative and opiate drugs, your loved one will wake up if there are no other reasons that keep your loved one in the induced coma. Number 2. Your critically ill loved one has kidney or liver abnormalities that stop the body from clearing all the sedative and opiate drugs that are floating in your loved one's body system. Both organs, the kidney and the liver, are responsible to not only process the drugs, but also to get rid of the drugs after they have been in the body system. Number 4. Studies have found that with increasing age, it takes longer for a critically ill patient to come out of an induced coma. As a rule of thumb, if your critically ill loved one is above the age of 60 to 70, there can be a delay to come out of an induced coma. Again, that's number 5. Again, as a rule of thumb, the longer your critically ill loved one has been placed in an induced coma, the likelihood of a delayed and slower waking up process is increasing. You and your family might have to be patient. Number 6. If your critically ill loved one has head or brain injuries and is in an induced coma, there could be a significant delay in waking up. There is a related article that I wrote, and you can click on the link, and the article is "How long does it take to wake up from a traumatic brain injury or severe head injury?" The other article I wrote about this topic is "How to take control if your loved one has a severe brain injury and is critically ill in intensive care," and again the link is below the video in the text version. In some instances, especially if the intensive care team suspects that your critically ill loved one may not have had sufficient oxygen supply to their brain for a prolonged period of time, there could be a delay for your loved one to wake up from the induced coma as well. And again, there's another article that I wrote, what is the prognosis after my critically ill loved one's brain has not had sufficient oxygen supply for a period of time. There is a link in the text version to this article below. In any case, the most important thing for you to know is that you need to be patient if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, especially if they're not waking up after the induced coma. The reality is that your critically ill loved one will recover and wake up in his or her own time. It's also extremely important that you and your family make up your own mind whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. The last thing you want is to be at the mercy of the intensive care team, and you want to have as much control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. How do you get to that all-important feeling of control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You will get that important feeling of control, power and influence by downloading your free Instant Impact Report by entering your email below now. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free reports, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability, even if your loved one is dying. 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to control, power and influence in your situation. You will get crucial behind the scenes insight so that you understand what's really happening in intensive care. How you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. With your free Instant Impact Report, you'll also get 4 other free reports, and the reports you will be receiving are the 6 questions you need to ask the most senior doctor in intensive care, 10 things you didn't know doctors and nurses are talking about while you're not at the bedside with your loved one, the 7 answers to the 7 most frequently asked questions if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, and 9 myths of being a critically ill patient in intensive care. Thank you for tuning into this week's Your Questions Answered, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our blog section or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week with another update.